Welcome to the Curatorial Roundtable. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the MA Curatorial Practice Program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. The program is a two-year master's program in every aspect of professional training toward entering the curatorial field. And the Curatorial Roundtable is a weekly event in which I invite distinguished curators and directors from around the world to speak about their practice, to speak about 2 or 3 exhibitions that have been transformative in their own work. And today I'm happy to have Bernardo José de Souza with us, and I'm just going to read a brief bio that Bernardo sent about himself, and then I will turn things over to him. So Bernardo is an independent curator based in Madrid and Rio de Janeiro. He worked as the artistic director of the Fundação Iberê Camargo in Porto Alegre, Brazil, until 2019. He was part of the curatorial team of Video Brazil Biennial held in Sao Paulo in 2015, and also a member of, in fact, one of our faculty at large, Sofia Hernandez Joncoy's curatorial team for the 9th Mercosul Biennial in Porto Alegre in 2013. From 2005 to 2013, Bernardo worked as the director of the Department of Cinema, Video, and Photography at the Secretary of Culture of Porto Alegre. For the past decade, he's been developing several projects in the visual arts field, including exhibitions, film programs, seminars, and publications, as well as educational programs, many of which developed in collaboration with institutions in Brazil and abroad, such as the Goethe Institute, Instituto Inhotim, KW Institute for Contemporary Art, the Prince Claus Fund, the Mondrian Fund, and Institut Français, among others. So with that, I will turn things over to Bernardo. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to be here with you today. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be sharing some of my recent and not so recent projects, and to be able to speculate on what these projects meant in my life, but also to develop a few debates on some pressing issues that have been informing curatorial practice in recent years. The 3 projects I will be presenting today, I guess I could say they could be understood as political platforms of sorts to travel in time towards the future by envisaging new scenarios and landscapes, or towards the past while revising history. But in both digressions, either towards the future or the past, I guess those digressions collide over the present time, and the battles and struggles and the pressing issues that concern climate change, and also many political debates that we've been addressing recently. Those projects, I think it's important to say that although they deal with a notion of science fiction in some extent, they are not really exhibitions with artworks made by artists who are interested in devising their science fictional worlds. They are more a collection of material elements, of artworks, which enable me to come up with landscapes and topographies that those topographies, yes, they do derive from a science fictional world. At times, those projects begin with a short science fiction story that I write, and they somehow work as an invitation for the public and the audience to enter into this new dimension. And at other times, they are just speculations on how the world, the bodies and the landscapes have been suffering different processes of transformation a long time. I guess most of these projects are very much interested in investigating the idea of finding familiarity in what appears strange, and strangeness in what it feels familiar. Therefore, ideas of alterity and otherness are key in those projects, as you will see, and also speculating about like a diversity of economies that conjure up worlds where the relationship with nature, with technology, between humans and other species are somehow coming to play in the process of creating those settings, those scenarios, those landscapes. Before I move into the actual projects, I would like to quote, and then I'll ask permission to read this little quote by Marisol de la Cadena, an anthropologist who's been of great help in my process of trying to make sense of what is going on in the world, a world where what has been taken for granted is now at stake, and we do have to revise what was understood as the epistemological discourses that have informed most of our practice in curating in recent years. So Marisol de la Cadena says that she speaks about the notion of a world of many worlds. And this notion derives from the Zapatista movements, the idea of a world where many worlds can fit. So she says we live in what we call a pluriverse, heterogeneous world formations brought together in a political ecology of diverse practices, negotiating the difficulty of being together in heterogeneity. After having said that, I will share my screen and move on to the actual projects. The first one that I would like to discuss with you is called The Negative Hands. This is a translation for the actual title, which is actually a translation from a French title. I'll get to it in a minute. But The Negative Hands was a project that emerged out of an invitation made by Lisette Lanhado, a former curator of both the São Paulo Biennial in the early 2000s and of a recent edition of the Berlin Biennial. I was living in Rio de Janeiro back then, and Lisette was working at Parque Lage, an institution that is located in the middle of a tropical forest in Rio de Janeiro. It is a mansion that used to belong to an opera singer who came up with this eclectic, tropical, neoclassic architecture. A beautiful building with an inner patio and an inner swimming pool. You'll see it in one of the images. And it's absolutely surrounded by the abundant nature of Rio de Janeiro. This history of this building, that before the construction of this mansion, it used to be a former sugarcane plantation, and this was before the actual reforestation of the area by the first emperor of Brazil after becoming independent from Portugal. And this place is today a school of arts and also a place for experimentation. So the invitation from Lisette was a carte blanche, allowing me not only to occupy the central edifice, but also the surrounding adjacent buildings in the forest. And they are many. There is a grotto, not a grotto that derives from the geological eras that produce grottos, but it's a fake grotto, one of those romantic architectures that used to be built in the 19th century, responding to a sense of reconnection with nature that is actually also informing some of our dreams about what nature can be today. But yeah, so there is a grotto, there is an oca. An oca is how in the vocabulary of the autochthonous population in Brazil, the indigenous population in Brazil, it's what they call a house. So there is this oca that was built in recent years, but is there sharing the very same grounds with this fake grotto, with this palazzo. A tower, also a fake attempt to create some sort of playground, possibly for kids, and all the bellic elements that are behind the idea of a fortress or of a tower. A fake aquarium, and a slave's laundry, where slaves would actually clean and wash the clothes. Moving into the actual project, and also important to say that Christ the Redeemer, for the ones who are familiar with the landscape of Rio de Janeiro, is this monumental sculpture of a Christ that is there sitting, I don't know how many thousand meters above our heads, watching the entirety of the city with its arms opened. So I began this project by understanding that both the natural landscape, the forest, this mansion, and all adjacent architectures were as much part of the project as the artworks themselves. And this has to do with something that has been triggering my imagination for a while now, which is what this geographer, Milton Santos, calls an unequal accumulation of time. As a geographer, he understands space as the accumulation, the overlapping and juxtaposition of different layers of time, from geological formations to nature and its transformations through agriculture, various industries, or simply the architectures and monuments built by different civilizations. So this was there as a backdrop and as the grounding of my curatorial project. The show, The Negative Hands, that I decided to move from the plural to the singular, so it's The Negative Hand, is named after a film by Marguerite Duras, a French writer and filmmaker, who made this film that was in one of the stills here. It was shot in Paris at dawn, as the city gradually acquires life. But she's reporting and related to a whole different moment in time, to the High Paleolithic era, where those paintings, the negative hands actually, were engraved, I could say, on the walls of these caves in Gargas in France. You might know, of course, those hands are the stencil-made hands. One of the earliest artworks we've heard and we've known of. And it's there implied a notion of identity, the individual that exists beyond the bunch or the tribe. And the film is exploring a narrative when the first man or woman understands that, it has a life of its own, of his own, of her own. So her film is there in the exhibition. It's one of the very few, if not the only, artwork that incorporates language as verbal or written language. As the film was translated, there was also, captions. So I guess the project was this you can see is like the aquarium, also one of those architectures I mentioned in a project developed by Leticia Ramos. And she created some virtual creatures that would inhabit the actual aquarium. What used to be water and where fishes would be moving around, she came up with these holograms of sorts. So the exhibition was actually taking place both indoors and outdoors. This is a sculpture by Erika Versucci, who's been playing with nature, transforming nature, and creating anomalies of sorts. Bodies that derive from recognizable shapes, but become some sort of monstrosity. And generally, he shows her works indoors as sculptures that we can see within the walls of institutions. And for the very first time, this bronze sculpture was shown outside. This you can have a glimpse of the actual palazzo I was referring to, with a flag or with a reproduction, a mirroring of the sky in Brazil, this constellation called Cruzeiro do Sul that helps people navigating across the globe, that as almost as if the skies had fallen into earth, into the swimming pool, actually. So I guess if on the one hand, I was addressing climate change, because the departure point for this show, sorry, I should have introduced it earlier. It is one of those shows that began with one of my short stories, the science fictions that I come up with, and that will be the cue for more elaborate projects dealing with political and philosophical themes. But the science fiction that I came up with for this project was set in 100 years after my birth in 2074 in Rio de Janeiro, after a huge wave had hit the city, left it partially underwater. And the following year, the torrid extreme temperatures of Rio de Janeiro created an exodus of sorts. You know, people were fleeing towards fresher areas in search of water, more landscapes, which actually provides the conditions for the enduring struggle in these moments of dramatic climate change. So this is the landscape, the setting for the show. And there is one element or one character in the show that is actually the one who writes the letter that works as an intro for the show. He decides in a very stoic movement to remain there, to remain in his mansion, to remain in the forest, to remain in Rio de Janeiro, surrounded by his pieces, by his artworks, by his books, by the memories of times past. So there is a bit of a decadent relationship with what humankind has produced over the years, but also this decision to face the calamity. And as only fiction allows us to, this character remains for years and years to come, for centuries perhaps, surrounded by his material collection of memories. And those elements in the building, in total isolation from the outside world, gradually this man notices that there are creatures approaching his lands and transforming not only the landscape around dimension, but also moving his collection of artworks from one place to another, almost as if they were playing tricks on his like daily life. So there was certain elements in the show which occupied more exhibition-like rooms, as this one that you see, that it used to be the place where the horses would be kept. And this one plays with an idea of bodies in transformation, new organic bodies, new shapes, new creatures, and playing with the notion of science fiction as a reality in transformation in a more straightforward way. While some other works, as this one by Daniel Stigman Mangrané, was placed in the grotto that I mentioned. It's one of his beautiful pieces, like geometric pieces, that was there in contrast against this very organic backdrop, although artificial. So I guess it's important also to say that if there is this preoccupation with climate change, this preoccupation with a world in transformation, with a landscape that acquires new shape, either through human action, through technology, or even because of the action of those aliens, those strangers, those unknown bodies that come to inhabit this very same area. The show is also self-reflexive in some extent. As I said before, most of the artworks do not use any sort of verbal or written language. So it's also a debate about how far can art communicate ideas. So on the one hand, the show is addressing the landscape, the bodies and technology in constant transformation. On the other, it's investigating the possibility of arts to communicate ideas outside of its natural environment, which would be the museum. But also, not only bringing arts out of context, in a sense, but also playing with an idea that is not new. And I think it was very well debated by Trevor Paglen in his project called The Last Pictures. The Last Pictures was a project devised by Trevor Paglen that consisted of sending to the gravitational fields of planet Earth a device or a satellite containing images from the Earth. And this project of Trevor Paglen is a reaction of the Voyager, a project developed by NASA in collaboration with Carl Sagan, a writer, but also a scientist, who used a golden disk to assemble their images from planet Earth to be sent to outer space in Voyager and to reach, other galaxies and other parts of the world. It was a dream of connecting with other species, with other life forms, and somehow entertaining the idea that human intelligence could communicate with other life forms and other species, which is an idea that, of course, we can easily discuss and can sound quite naive, as our verbal communication or our understanding of the elements through which you can convey ideas and elaborate on our nature are very much the results of our experience as a life form. So possibly other lives wouldn't be able to understand it anyway. So what Trevor Paglen does is to send these the satellites not to outer space, but to be around Earth in this belt of other satellites, which is basically like space trash, the debris of, the several technological attempts of humankind to occupy, the universe and outer space. So I guess Trevor Paglen was in my mind when I was developing this project and thinking, so what if aliens landed in Rio de Janeiro? What would be the chances that they could understand what we understand as our very creations, the ones that are so revealing of how we live, what we think, and what our experience as civilization has come to mean in the course of time. This is a film, 16mm film by Cyprien Gaillard. He's there portraying Mexico, and this destructive relationship that tourists have with the environment there, and the idea of a collapse of a civilization, as we've been debating lengthily in recent years, in regards to our not only our relationship to nature as such, but also to each other and to other cultures, and to the constructs of other cultures in different parts of the world. Moving on, this is an artwork by Alana Narbutaitė from Lithuania, and this is the indigenous oca I was referring to before. And what she did is an invisible artwork. I mean, except for this the solar plaque sitting on top of the indigenous building. This was actually used, the solar plaque, so that she could emit a laser ray, a transparent laser ray into the ground, and according to her, these laser lights would bring together a diversity of different species. And I remember, if I'm not mistaken, she was particularly interested in the snakes, the owls. I mean, she told me there was some scientific knowledge behind these laser lights, and they would actually bring together, as in like a dance or a ritual of sorts between these creatures. This is by Barrão, a sculpture that, once again, normally is displayed indoors. It's just a collection of those plinths of sorts that sustain the water basin in toilets around the world. Of course, they are like old-fashioned ones. Here, a beautiful artwork by Felipe Braga, that you read onde é dia, veja-se noite, is basically where there is day, see it as night. And therefore, this filter that is somehow is trying to bring into the artwork the idea in film of what they call in French, la nuit américaine, and in English, it's called day by night. This strategy to create night, landscapes using just a filter, like as if a moonlight was hitting, the camera. And also interesting that the structure of this project, or of this piece, is also an appropriation of Lina Bobardi, an Italian architect who moved to Brazil and developed her career as an architect in Brazil, working for different arts institutions. She was also behind the creation of the Museum of Art of São Paulo, that now, after so many years, without any of her creations being there on display. They once again returned to her original way of displaying artworks, of displaying two-dimensional pieces like paintings and such. And so what you see here is actually one of her displays on which curators hang paintings or photographies or such. So he's sort of mixing different references to come up with these totem elements in relation to the natural world. Mauricio Yanez, an artist from Brazil, working mostly with performance. And what he came up with for this show was this idea of occupying and living outdoors in the park during the whole period of the exhibition, out of what nature provided him with. And of course, with the help of strangers, people who would come by and address him and ask questions for him, and to which he would only respond in the future tense. So there was no past or no present tense in these conversations, only elaborations and envisioning the future. Tommaso De Luca is an Italian artist who was interested in this selection of drawings. He was investigating how the colonial enterprise, how reaching different parts of the globe, and the idea of bringing in those travelings illnesses and pandemics from here and there, how those illnesses would also affect the material culture. So furnitures change shape, furnitures become animals, become anomalies themselves, endowed with some life of their own. This was a performance by Luciana Brites that I could say, I guess, has a hint of the Butoh performances, but it was in another of those crazy settings created in this around this mansion, which is this lake that you can see in the image. And then this was in the underground of the mansion, and Leo Felipe came up with a collection, almost like an archaeological investigation of the pornography consumed by us humans on different levels. So it was his own editing of footage from different porn films that he's been possibly watching himself. This was the dining room of the mansion, and Susana Guardado decided to do a party, which was meant to be a 24-hour party that would last, until the following day. Of course, it wasn't possible. I mean, the institution has, its constraints, but also the very idea of keeping people, in a party for 24/7, for 24 hours wasn't exactly feasible in all possible respects. And there, what you can see on the screen is like sequences, or actually the whole picture was being projected. It's a film with Jane Fonda. They do shoot horses, don't they? That goes back to that time in the history of the US, when people were in depression and recession, and people would would go to these parades, of dancing, and until the very last, human being was still up there and dancing, and the winner would, of course, in return, receive the prize, a prize in money. So different artworks were actually there to conform, to create this landscape that derived from different times in history, from different realities that would somehow collide. And it was almost as if that was a heterotopic zone of sorts, a place that obeyed its own enclosed logic, its own elements, its own narratives, a life of its own. Of course, you can imagine that working in such a location, in such a building, historical building, nature around it, there were many different dramas and problems that permeated the entire process of giving shape to the show. One of them, of course, how to keep artworks outside, and it's not as if we had cameras all over, the forest. So this was something that had to be dealt with artists one by one, discussing with them if it would be possible for them to allow us to have their works outside. Galleries got in the middle. Some of them didn't want to allow us. So it was like a one-to-one decision that had to be made along the way. Then obviously there was the idea of showing porn. So where to show it, how to prevent people, minors, to enter that space. And some people were shocked by what we were presenting. And then, like, as it was also shocking for Lisette Lanhado, the curator who invited me to come up with this show, because I wanted to place Marguerite Duras' film on the ground, projected on the ground on a huge flat screen right at the entrance of the Palazzo. And then it was not possible because, the people in the institution said that people would, trip on it and the artwork would be destroyed. It could be like a hazard. And so I decided that I would move the screen as in airports, and the flat screens they are high up in the ceiling. To which Lisette Lanhado reacted vigorously, telling me that this was Marguerite Duras, that it was Nouvelle Vague, a very important historical name, and I couldn't place her up there as if, as people do in airports. So I ended up finding a beautiful spot for the film, and it all worked out well. Also, there was the problem of how in an actual forest, how to have artworks displaced around this landscape, and also making sure that people would see every and each of these artworks that were in the middle of nature. So we had to come up with a floor plan for the show, a floor plan sort of guiding people through nature. And it's not like a park as we have in New York. It's just sort of like abundant, excessive nature all over. The type of forest that one could get lost, among the lianas and all the species. So we had a quite comfortable budget, but it wasn't like anything that would allow us to do every single thing we had in mind. So all those things had to be dealt with, like not having more text in the printed matter, but having this map that would allow people to move around. The drawings of Tommaso De Luca that had to come from Italy, how they would go back. So getting in touch with embassies and see if they would be able to organize the transportation, basically doing what curators have to do at one point, which is becoming a producer. I mean, part of the life of the curator is the life of a producer, finding solutions with the artists, with reinventing the reality of the exhibition space to make things possible. And of course, as we were dealing with this unknown lands, so the solutions were far more difficult to come up with. I think from here,
I think we have time for, if you jump into one more show, it's almost 9:45. Should we do that? There was one question, by the way,
yes,
which was simply, what was the name of the geographer you mentioned at the start of the presentation? Was that Milton Santos? What was that?
Yes, Milton Santos. Yes.
Right. So Milton Santos, Santos.
Yes, exactly. He is no longer alive. He was teaching at the Sorbonne throughout the 70s and 80s, and was like a seminal figure in addressing politics through geography. No, let me see here. Well, so here is the other project that I wanted to talk about, called After the End. I was invited to become the artistic director of Fundação Iberê Camargo, an amazing building designed by Álvaro Siza, a Portuguese architect who won the Pritzker Prize in the late 90s at some point. And my task was to turn this very vertical institution into a more horizontal space to which many different communities and publics could converge to. So my idea was that the institution should work as a magnetic field of sorts, bringing together different institutions, different publics, and such. And the idea for this show, as it was for the audio show, it also departs from a science fiction that I wrote. But the idea was to deal with the notion of the end, not only the end of the world, but of the institution itself. Because the institution, the future of the institution was at stake at that point. This major mining company, which had been subsidizing the institution for many years, was involved into many different kinds of political and economic scandals of corruption in Brazil. And this was a very sensitive moment. And to me, it made sense to come up with a project that would be made exclusively with artworks that were there in Porto Alegre, that existed there in museums, in private collections, in art galleries, in the studios of artists, and that's what we did. So the idea was that this building, which is completely refractory to the outside world, it is a Guggenheim of sorts. It has the very same modus operandi that you begin either from the top or from the ground floor, and you go ascending or descending in a spiral. There is no windows except for this one that you are seeing there. So no connection with the outside world. And this was the main drama of the institution at that point. So my idea for this science fiction was that the atmosphere, the outside world, had become poisonous. And these noxious atmospheres forced the people into bunkers of sorts. And therefore, this museum became a bunker, but also the place to be inhabited by the population. So one of the floors was basically devised as a domestic setting. So there you'd find furniture, you'd find different elements from different moments in art history, from sculpture that you see there from the 18th century to paintings from the early 20th century, from the 19th century, and so on. Or even this Yves Klein photograph. So it was like a collection of elements as museums work, actually. Museums are meant to be preserving the legacies, the inheritances, the heritages of civilizations, and the exhibition was somehow making once again all those temporalities collapse in one single space. So this is what you can see. I'm not going to be speaking specifically about the artworks. This is a video by Cintia Marcelli called The Century. Jorge Macchi with this counting down little video as if announcing the end of something or the beginning of something else. Furniture was there as well. And in some of my shows, I like to combine what we call artworks with elements of design or even antique objects. And in this particular show, of course, it made total sense. And the other floor was some laboratory of sorts. This laboratory was dealing with technologies and creatures and life forms in transformation. You could barely recognize the shapes of some of these elements. And as the architecture works as in a spiral, how to make people understand that they should begin by the ground floor or from, so there was no beginning and no end to this narrative. People would either begin from the domestic environment or from the laboratory-like floor. And so all these temporalities would collapse along the way, the promenade. This you can see the building that is in immediate contact with the outer world, as in there is a river passing by, there is nature, a forest behind the building, but it's completely oblivious to the world behind it. So I know you're running short of time, but let me see if there is another thing like that was important to talk about this project. Yeah, well, and this show is kind of funny because it became almost like a visionary show because it was opened in 1917, and a few years later we had COVID, and we all had to go indoors and protect ourselves from the outside world. So this is also the funny thing about science fiction, how how in some extent we are, because by addressing the future we are addressing the present, and how those notions of temporalities collapse, and how more and more those notions of temporalities have been collapsing in our present world, as we see different ways of embracing, of understanding the world, of experiencing the world in different scales, through different political perspectives, different economic lenses across the globe. So I don't know how are we doing for time, Stephen? I had
So, yeah, you could speak a little bit more, I think, and then I would like to open it to other questions that you can, anyone in the audience can put in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And, we can go a little bit over 10 if you need more time, Bernardo.
Okay. Yes, no, there was this other project that I think it makes sense in this talk to bring the three of them together. This project is from last year at the Kunstverein, the Neue Kunstverein in Vienna. And as you can see, this industrial architecture, it used to be a former, as they say in German, Autohaus, a car shop, an Audi car shop that was converted into this Kunstverein, which are these art spaces that exist all over Austria and Germany. And when this invitation came to me and to Ursula, this project was curated alongside an artist called Ursula Mayer. It became obvious that we had to address the architecture and the Autohaus, this former temple of consumption and fetishism. And the idea was that it had become this temporary shelter, in a moment that wasn't quite clear when it took place. I began the text by saying year unknown. So it could either be the present or the future or the past. And some friends, just gonna get some image that I think some friends told me that this show was somehow like a car crash. And I quite liked it because the idea was to investigate this. I was also very much under the impact of war in Ukraine. And Ursula and I decided to talk about destruction and construction and degeneration, regeneration. So we had like different species, like these little creatures made out of this vegetable devised by Cristiano Leinhardt, sharing, the same grounds with like this heart, which is like a projection, a virtual heart, or maybe with this AT generated poem or language. So technology and organic life and different species and different constructs, material constructs were sharing this tent, this temporary shelter, and the idea was to there was no human presence in the show except but the body was demanded all over the exhibition, like these little cement bags with the airplane pillows as playing the role of beds for people to have a nap. So the idea of workers, but also these are the bench here. Let me see if I can show you this. Well, and the single image of a human being in the exhibition was this now I would say historical piece by Skip Arnold, an American artist who works very much as a performer, but also comes up with little videos. In this video, he's basically throwing his body against a wall, a white cube, wearing these helmets with the American flag. So there was this notion of life under threats, of suffering in this liminal context of the exhibition. That was basically stretching, dealing with an idea of endurance. I think the whole exhibition dealt with a notion of endurance. What could last? What could not last? What could be transformed? what could be of an asset for these moments of exception, you know, and but basically understanding this space as a threshold of sorts. And therefore the title of the exhibition, which is The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, which is an appropriation of the translation for English of the title of a Brazilian novel. And the title in English has absolutely nothing to do with the original title in Portuguese, but it is the author is investigating this culture of the sertões, this part of Brazil that is very arid, very dry, and where the oral history is a key element of their process of keeping, you know, their culture and their ancestries alive. But also The Devil to Pay in the Backlands, as you know, as in English, it makes a lot more sense for you than for me, being Brazilian. It's also about who is this devil, and of course capitalism was there you know, as an ever emanating ghost in this construction. So there is this little quote, and maybe we can finish after this, because the text began by the title of the exhibition, then Vienna Year Unknown, and then a quote from an author that is very dear to me called Jean Genet, that said, but the bodies in the figureheads which they formed looked into the darkness as one looks into the future. And then the text goes, not as a fiction, no, more as a curatorial text. And at one point in the curatorial text, I quote the author of the book that whose title was used for the exhibition. And he goes, doesn't everyone sell his soul? I tell you, sir, the devil does not exist. There is no devil, yet I sold him my soul. That is what I'm afraid of. To whom did I sell it? That is what I'm afraid. That's what I'm afraid of, my dear sir. We sell our souls, only there is no buyer. So yes, of course there is an allusion to Faust by Goethe and selling the soul to the devil, but also there are also many compromises we make in our current lives in an overwhelming capitalist society. How do we relate to others and to capitalism, of course, to material culture, and ultimately to life.
Great. So there was one question, Bernardo, which essentially from Michael Krasowitz, essentially asking how you form the concept. Is it from looking at work and then you form the concept, or is it that you come up with a concept and then you look for works of art that fit your concept?
It depends, because some of my ideas they emerge from things I see, from you know, psychoanalytic sessions with my shrink, or from books I read, from films I see, from conversations I have, but generally from very pressing issues that are there, you know, like informing our debates, either at a bar or with peers or the curators and such. But no, I think generally I have an idea, like a mental image of this landscape or this topography that I would like to create, and gradually I address artists one by one, sometimes knowing what I have in mind, but most of the time just bringing up a conversation, and as the conversation unfolds, we in common agreements understand that these would make sense. It's either time to commission a new artwork or to bring back to surface an artwork from decades ago. I'm not one of those curators who are always working with the next big name or trends. I repeat artworks from time to time. I like to show artworks from living artists from 3, 5, 15 years ago. So it's like a combination of my mental collection of images from whatever I'm reading or yeah. So, but generally it's more like an intuition that I should be dealing with certain elements, discursive or visual.
Great. Okay. So with that, we will end the public session. We'll join the students separately. Great, Bernardo. Thank you so much for the public presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all.